Would you support a transportation and mobility study for your community? Do you know what a transportation and mobility study includes? On this show, my guests and I will discuss just what having such a study might mean for your community. Stay tuned to Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to the show. In 2017, the City Council members in East Palo Alto agreed to make the development of a comprehensive citywide transportation and mobility plan one of their council's top priorities. They agreed that the study would address traffic congestion, parking problems, and cut-through traffic on city streets. They also wanted the study to examine the overall circulation and mobility issues that existed in the city. Well, the Transportation and Mobility Study Council members wanted is now underway, and many who are familiar with it are wondering what it will accomplish and whether it will result in any worthwhile city improvements. I feel fortunate in having Susan Barnes with me today to talk about her work as the Mobility Project Manager for East Palo Alto's Transportation and Mobility Plan. Susan is a FUSE Executive Fellow. She has been working with East Palo Alto's Transportation and Mobility Studies since October of 2018. Susan has more than 20 years of experience in economic development and public policy. She has worked in Palo Alto, San Jose, Redwood City, and Hayward, and has extensive experience in workforce development, economic development, strategy development and formation, and in the use of various economic development tools. She started her own consulting business in 2010 and has worked with Contra Costa Water District, Santa Cruz County, Downtown San Mateo Association, the City of Pacifica, and the City of Rohnert Park and Skyline College. Prior to starting her consulting business, Susan was the manager of economic development and redevelopment for the City of Palo Alto for 12 years. Welcome, Susan. It's a pleasure to have you here with me.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Now, given all of your experience with various cities and your consulting business, why did you decide to be a FUSE Fellow?
Do you know, I was enjoying the consulting that I was doing, but when I was approached by the recruiter, you only have so many opportunities in your career to do something that really is impactful in a community. And the opportunity to work on one project instead of 30 in a city is really a luxury. And I thought, here's a project where I really could make a difference by being able to connect the dots for the city and being able to, work with stakeholders within the city and get people to be thinking about the transportation issues and mobility issues in East Palo Alto as a regional problem, not an East Palo Alto problem. And that mattered a lot to me.
Sure. Now, we've had one of your colleagues, Jerry Chang, on the show talking about FUSE Fellows and how he became involved. And you said that you were recruited. Did someone come to you directly, or did you see a notice about?
Someone reached out to me on LinkedIn. And I kind of thought, oh, well, whatever. But then when I took a look at what the project was, and, I was born and raised in this area, and so I knew East Palo Alto well because I was raised about 10 miles north. And I thought, boy, this could really make a difference in the quality of life for East Palo Alto residents. And I thought, let me give it a try.
Sure. Now, you just now said it's not just a city issue, mobility transportation, it's region-wide.
Yes.
Now, what happens, explain that, because we're talking about East Palo Alto's transportation and mobility plan. So how do you connect that up as a regional plan,
Well,
or is it connected as a regional plan?
let me explain by saying that 84% of the trips that are in East Palo Alto don't start there or end there. So that means that only 16% of those trips that are in East Palo Alto are local trips. So what that means is people are passing through the town, and they're passing through the town from the East Bay to Highway 101 or to Facebook or to Google going south or whatever. So it's people passing through that are really having an impact on the quality of life for East Palo Alto residents.
And that's not the case for, let's say, Palo Alto or San Mateo or Redwood City?
No, you know, the jobs housing balance with which I'm sure you're familiar is around 3-to-1 for cities like Palo Alto and around 3-to-1 for cities like Sunnyvale and Menlo Park, Mountain View. In East Palo Alto, there's only 1/5 of a job per employable resident. So we're talking about a city that's not jobs rich, where people are passing through the place where people live on their way to a job elsewhere. So it has to be a regional problem because people are passing through to get to these other jobs that don't exist in East Palo Alto.
And those jobs do exist in other cities. However, I'm wondering, the traffic that might originate in Palo Alto, would it come from Palo Alto residents?
No. I mean, much more so than in East Palo Alto. But, you know, Palo Alto, I'm sure, deals with some pass-through traffic too. And they actually have several initiatives to deal with single occupancy vehicles and things like that, because they don't want one person in a car either, because it's going to gum things up as well. So these regional problems are all of our regional problems. It's just that East Palo Alto is far more impacted.
How so?
Because of the jobs
Yes.
housing balance.
But I'm saying, what is the problem given the fact that a lot of traffic is passing through? That's East Palo Alto isn't its destination. So what are the problems that creates for the city?
Well, one thing that makes East Palo Alto stand apart is the fact that University Avenue is not a state route. Like Willow Street is a state route. University Avenue is a city street. So all of the maintenance and all of that kind of stuff has to be paid for by the city of East Palo Alto.
As it would be University Avenue in Palo Alto, right?
Yes, but it doesn't carry the kind of pass-through traffic. If you notice, University Avenue in Palo Alto goes down to a 2-lane street in several places. In East Palo Alto, it's much more of a thoroughfare. It's four lanes
Yes.
across and things like that. So it is very much more of a thoroughfare, and it's a direct link between the Dumbarton Bridge and Highway 101. And that's not really the case in Palo Alto.
However, in Palo Alto, there are a lot of stores,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So that would certainly account for people coming in, shopping at the stores. But what you're saying is, it doesn't, even with all of the stores, it doesn't account for an equivalent amount of traffic.
Well, and East Palo Alto is not enriched by this. You know, it's very difficult to have a storefront on a street that's gridlocked, you know, 4 hours a day. And you'll see when you go down University Avenue in East Palo Alto that there's no parking on either side of the street in many places. And the other thing that happens is that, you know, having worked for Palo Alto is very sales tax rich. It gets a lot of benefit, you know, from the stores that exist on University Avenue. And if you compare those sales tax revenues to those in East Palo Alto, even though it's a much smaller city, well, it's actually not a much smaller city. It's half the size of Palo Alto. It's much more under-resourced because there are not those revenues that contribute to the overall well-being of the community.
So given the traffic, all of the traffic that's going through, would that have been enough for the city council in East Palo Alto to say we want a mobility study, a transportation study? Or are there also some other issues that might be involved?
You know, I think it has a lot to do with the negative impact on residents' quality of life. You hear stories of school children having to take an hour and a half to get to school in a town that's only 2.5 square miles. You don't see that in other communities, and those kinds of impacts to people's quality of life really have to be addressed. And I think that that's why this city council has undertaken this study, because of the amount of cut-through traffic, the fact that Waze and Google route people through the city. And I think every city in the Silicon Valley deals with that to a certain degree. It's just that the degree is so much more intense in East Palo Alto.
And I've also heard that read statistics indicate that the rate of asthma
Yes.
in East Palo Alto is the highest in the county.
That's right.
And that might be also something traffic related, the impact of all of the pollution going through.
Yes.
So these are the type of issues that would have maybe motivated the city council to talk about a mobility study.
Absolutely.
Yes. Now, you came on October 2018. Was it specifically to work on the mobility study?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Talk about it. What does it involve?
Well, I mean, having worked for city governments for a good part of my career, you're always doing 30 projects, and you never have the ability to really sort of laser focus on one thing, to really be able to connect all the dots and be able to sort of really focus on those things that make sense. So for example, when, say Sustainable Silicon Valley comes to us and says, we want to do something to measure the emissions on University Avenue, because we know that East Palo Alto children are having more of a negative impact because of the emissions. It gives us the opportunity to really sort of focus on that and say, oh yeah, this ties in perfectly to what we're doing, because it's going to help us create a baseline, number one, because that's what other cities have told us. We've communicated with other cities in places like Foster City, which has a similar but different situation on Hillsdale Boulevard, and their children aren't being impacted in the same kind of way, but they told us it's really important to get a baseline.
Now, talk about that baseline. What is a baseline? A baseline including what?
Well, I mean, if we don't know where we start, how do we know what we've accomplished?
So what's the starting point? What are some of the issues or some of the indicators?
I think I'm sorry?
The amount of traffic going in?
That's part of it.
Okay, where it's going through the city?
And what Waze and Google may be doing in order to sort of exacerbate that problem, how those algorithms are having a negative impact.
Oh, when you talk about Google, you mean like Google Maps?
Exactly,
Leading people
those are together
through,
now, yeah.
Okay, okay. Routing people to avoid traffic on University Avenue.
Exactly.
Yeah, I made the mistake of going to a city council meeting one evening and having to go only 2 miles from Palo Alto to East Palo Alto, and I made the mistake of taking University Avenue from Embarcadero, and it took me all of 45 minutes to go, about 2 miles. And I just thought, I'll never do that.
Right.
So, but there are not a lot of roads into the city or around the city. So there are not a lot of options.
But there are options through neighborhoods, and you can be routed, through those neighborhoods. And if
once you get to the city, I mean, once you, yes. Okay.
And think about why is your child not walking to school? Because you don't feel safe with your child crossing the street with somebody who's unfamiliar with the city, cutting through and maybe going a little too fast or something like that, So parents are actually not on purpose contributing to the problem, because they can't let their child out of on a bike or on foot.
So when you say contributing to the problem, contributing to some of the health issues?
Well, to the traffic at least.
Well, if you don't let your child out, how are you contributing to oh, you mean driving? Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Driving the child every place.
I mean, wouldn't you preferably like to have your child walk to school and be able to sort of have that experience that we had? I mean, like I said, I grew up in this area, and we walked a little bit over 2 miles to school every day.
Or biked. It's great exercise. And
yeah.
We're dealing with issues of obesity in children now, and diabetes, and a lot of other health issues because of a lack of exercise. And you really can't get a lot of exercise if you're right there with a lot of traffic, if you're trying to exercise outdoors.
Right.
So you talked about the baseline, and so we're talking about some of the considerations in terms of developing a baseline.
Right. I mean, I think what you really want is a snapshot. So you say, okay, at the beginning of this journey that we're on, um, where were we, you know? And if we're impacting cut-through traffic, did those no left turns on University Avenue, those new signs that we may or may not put up, did those have an impact? But if we don't know where we started, how are we going to know if they had any kind of an impact?
Have you created that baseline?
We're working on it.
Okay.
You know, we've for the parking study that's a part of the mobility study, we've actually had the consultant, Hexagon Consultants, do some snapshots of where we're at in terms of parking and other issues within the city. I mean, East Palo Alto is one of the most dense cities in the Silicon Valley. And, you know, we have more people per household, more cars per household, and the census shows us this. And so if we take a good snapshot of where we are today, we're going to have a really good idea of what things we did that had a positive impact and where we may want to do some other things that are similar to that.
Now, when you say the most dense city, are we talking about 2 miles, very small city with a lot of people in it?
Yes.
As you mentioned, and a lot of cars. And I think I was reading somewhere where there might be at least 4 cars per family.
It's interesting that you say that. I mean, we've seen some of that, but we've actually done a survey of over 400 residents that are in East Palo Alto, and we're seeing more than 2 cars per family, and in some cases, you know, up to that 4 or 5 cars per family. But, you know, we're really working really hard to do really effective community outreach and layering that so that we're getting good information.
And the thing about it is when we're talking about per family, we probably should be talking about per household, because in one household there are multiple families.
Yes.
Aha, which would account for all of the cars.
We're also hearing stories about Airbnb and things like that because of the housing affordability crisis and the fact that people are now, you're renting spaces and things like that. And you could have up, like when we did a community meeting in the Gardens neighborhood, what they told us, or actually it was at the YMCA, but it was about the Gardens neighborhood. People told us we're really concerned because we're seeing up to 9 cars in a household because of Airbnb issues. And anecdotally, this is the kind of thing that people are telling us.
And I think another issue is the fact that a lot of the residents themselves might have businesses as gardeners and have trucks, gardeners, plumbers, and other types of businesses where they would park their trucks or their vans also at their house.
Yes, and I think that's a good point, but I think that we need to circle back and we need to say, you know, again, this is not an East Palo Alto problem. This is really a regional problem. And part of the problem is that people from other cities do park in East Palo Alto. And when you're taking up that kind of parking, you can't have the normal kind of parking ratio that you might have, say, in San Jose or somewhere else, where you could have your landscaper truck on the street, or you could, it's those vehicles that don't move or those vehicles that come from other places, I think, that are really causing the problem, or the majority of the problem. We want to acknowledge the fact that it could be exacerbated by other things like, you know, a landscaping truck or something, but that there are other external factors that are having an impact.
Most people would know when we talk about transportation issues what transportation includes. Mobility might be a new concept in this respect. So when we're talking about mobility issues, what are we talking about? Just how people move around?
Yes, we're talking about that. We're talking about parking, and we're talking about how people move around and things like that. But we're also talking about our present as well as our future. So one of the things that the mobility study is paying attention to, or the mobility project is paying attention to, are policies like a traffic impact fee. Every other city around East Palo Alto has had traffic impact fees for many years, which actually, you know, take cars off the road and come up with workarounds to make sure that not so many cars are getting on the road, and things like transportation demand management policies and things like that. And the city of East Palo Alto has had that policy for a while, but it's not been implemented. So we're redoing that policy too. So we're trying again, you know, to hit it at a couple of different layers. One, in terms of the day-to-day quality of life, and secondly, in policies that are going to impact the future for a long time.
We talked about establishing a baseline.
Yes.
Like that might be the first step. Let's talk about the next one. What happens after the baseline is established? Or is this something that's continuous? You're continuing to establish this baseline. Is it ongoing, or is it like a fixed point? We have this baseline.
I think there's a baseline, and then you take a look at what the impacts to the baseline are, you know? And so, for example, you know, you may try speed humps or traffic humps or something like that. And did they slow the traffic? Did they decrease the number of trips, you know? And then you have something to measure against.
But these are things that are already in place.
No.
Well, you start with the baseline in terms of the traffic mobility plan. We're still talking about planning, right? Planning stage, not implementation.
Yes, you're right about that. What we're doing is we're establishing a baseline so that we can come forward. What Hexagon is doing is...
And this is the consulting firm.
That's the consulting firm.
Working with the city to put this transportation and mobility plan in place.
Yes, and they've come up with a number of recommendations based on information that we've gotten from the community and on their own particular studies. And with those recommendations, they're coming forward and they're saying, okay, we're suggesting you do this, we're suggesting you do this, and then what we're doing is we're vetting that, you know, with the community and trying to get a good sense of, does this make sense? Because the community are the ones that are there 24 hours a day.
So where are we? The plan started, the project started in October. Mm-hmm. Now, that was maybe 10 months ago. Mm-hmm. And what has gone on in that length of time? The baseline?
Yes. Establishing a baseline, doing some studies. The length of the
What
term,
kind of studies?
Parking studies. They've gone into neighborhoods at midnight and said, okay, here's how many cars are on the street. Here's what we think the deficit is. Here's what the supply is.
The deficit in terms of parking places?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so then based on the information that they've been able to put together and the information from public meetings that we've done, they've made some recommendations that the community has said, this works, this doesn't work, this works, this doesn't work. And one of the hardest things about this is people are really split on what works for their community and what doesn't. I mean, imagine yourself being, you know, parents with 3 children and everybody has to have a car to get to work. Does it work for you to have a parking permit program that only gives you 2 permits for the household? Maybe not.
Why would a city need to give its residents parking permits if they have their own house?
Because a lot of people don't park in their own driveways. A lot of people don't park.
Why not?
Some of them because of the housing affordability issue. A lot of garages have been converted to living units. A lot of driveways are not available for parking. One of the suggestions that Hexagon has made is that people could, in fact, park in their own driveways and not get a ticket for it. And people are supporting that.
I would think not only park in their own driveway, in their own garage, if it's available, but in front of their house. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So why would one need a parking permit?
Because somebody else is parked there.
Well...
And if you don't permit that, then the others that park there...
And you can't just say to somebody, you can't park in front of my house, it's a public...
No, and if you're parking from another nearby community, you're displacing people that are already there. I mean, it's a basic supply and demand issue.
So how do you regulate something like that?
You know, we're working out the details of that. Like, we really don't want to overpromise. We really want to take a look at what might work and what might not. So one of the things that we're doing, for example, in the Gardens neighborhood, is we've just done a mailer to 1,200 homes in the Gardens neighborhood. We're going to have a public meeting on August 14th. And we've asked people to fill out a survey and say, do you park in front of your house? Would you support a parking permit program? You know, and things like that, to really sort of try to get a good idea of what might work and what might not work.
So if you instituted parking permits, and that wouldn't necessarily be throughout the city, would it?
We're focusing one neighborhood at a time, with the Gardens being the one we're starting with. And that could be our pilot.
And the idea might be 2 parking permits?
Do you know, nothing has been cast in concrete, but what we have done is lay out some scenarios about what might happen, and then get feedback from people about what makes sense to happen.
Okay. We have a few slides, and maybe if we can run through them and you can tell us what they are, how
Sure.
they fit into the mobility plan, if they're a part of the mobility plan.
Okay.
Now, we talked about the baseline, so we have that baseline. And then we have some suggestions. And that baseline looks at what the issues are involving the city. The traffic, the problems that people have because of the traffic.
The emissions, yeah.
Oh, okay. And so from that, we have some suggestions, recommendations on the table that are being taken to the community.
Yes.
Okay.
And then based on those conversations, those will go then probably in September this year to the city council, for their action or for
That's
them.
pretty quick, isn't it? If for a study that just started in October 2018.
The term of study is 12 to 18 months, and we're trying to be of action. I mean, people have talked about this issue for 20 years, and we would really like to have a positive impact.
Has it been a problem for 20 years?
I think it has. I think it's worse than it has been, but yes.
I would think so. So whenever we have the, okay, so whenever we have the slides ready, we can start talking about the slides. Now, this is the cover for the mobility study, all right? And we're not going with everything in that study. We're just going through a few slides. So
This is actually a presentation that was done to the Public Works and Transportation Commission, and these are slides that were presented to them.
the East Palo Alto Public Works
Yes.
and Transportation. And the next one? And what is that? It's like traffic calming action number 1. What might something like that include?
This particular one talks about signal light synchronization and how not having to be stopped at every single light might keep the traffic flow moving a little bit smoothly, or it could slow it down in areas that are problematic. So you really kind of take control of the situation. And with University Avenue being a city street, the city has the ability to do that.
Now, this is a suggestion.
Some of this is, yes, yeah,
Okay.
this is a suggestion.
And can we go on to traffic calming action 2? And that would be, could we have that monitor moved a little bit closer? Well, let's just kind of run through, since we can't see it too well, if we could just kind of run through what some of the traffic calming actions are.
Sure. We have a number of traffic calming actions that we've been talking about. We could modify signal timing to meter traffic at gateway intersections. What that would mean is that what we were talking about, how it makes some sense to, at different gateway intersections, be able to either slow or speed up traffic to keep the flow going in a way that's helpful.
Okay, so this one is, if we can see it. Can you see that? I'm sure that our audience can see it very well.
Yeah, it's modifying the signal timing to meter traffic at gateway
Oh,
intersections. Yeah.
okay. Modifying signal traffic and calming action number 3, if we have those in order. And can you see number 3?
Yeah, this one is talking a little bit about on University Avenue, doing no left turn signs at specific areas and then enforcing that so that people are not cutting through town, but they're staying on University Avenue. So if we do have gridlock, we have it on University Avenue, but we're not creating an unsafe situation, throughout town, and we're not, making it worse.
Now, no left turns. Right now, I'm thinking there's streets. What happens if people are on University Street and they live on a street like Bell Street, where they have to make a left-hand turn off of University?
It would be available to local traffic, and you see that in a lot of cities. I was in Sunnyvale the other day, and it was saying for local traffic only, and we could use some of those portable signs.
So do you think someone from out of the city passing through would not turn left if a sign said for local traffic only? How is somebody supposed to tell whether this person who just turned left is a part of the local traffic living in that city.
You know, we're trying to work all of this out, but it's likely that somebody on University Avenue is probably not turning left or right. They're probably using city streets in order
Just
to
to
be able
go
to
through.
traverse. Yeah.
Unless it's a parent coming home from work, wanting to go home or just picked up their child. What would be an idea of traffic planning number 3? Are we at 3? I think we did 3, and we're now perhaps at traffic calming 4. How many traffic calmings ideas are there?
Well, we actually have 17, so I don't know if you want to go through
Well, we
all
can
of
go
those.
through just a few more.
Okay. We would,
This is traffic calming number 4.
number 4, no through traffic signs. So on certain streets, we wouldn't allow through traffic. We would only allow local traffic. So that, again, that cut through traffic is really sort of short-circuited a little bit.
In spite of what Google Maps might say.
Well, that's an interesting question because we would work closely with Google Maps and with Waze, and we're trying to initiate those conversations. The way that it's worked in Foster City is that they've tried a pilot program on Hillsdale Boulevard, and there are no left turn signs on part of it. And then Google has given them the permission to change the algorithms internally so that it no longer routes people down the no left turn area.
And I guess you would have to do that with other organizations like MapQuest and
Yes.
all of them. And I wonder, would it be in their interest to abide by that, or would they feel a loyalty to their customers to give them the most direct way possible?
East Palo Alto residents are their customers, and I think that every city in the peninsula or in the Silicon Valley is dealing with this kind of an issue with cut-through traffic to some degree, and they want the streets to be safe like we want the streets to be safe. So we need to figure out some compromises that work for both of us.
Makes a lot of sense. And is there, you said there's 17, what?
Yeah, and I
number
don't want to
5
go
might
through all
be?
of them, but we're looking at all-way stop signs. Is that 5? Yeah.
Always.
Oh, you know, a lot of our signs are old in East Palo Alto, and so what you'll find is that they've faded away or something like that. Or like I travel Embarcadero Road, and I turn right on Pulgas, and there used to be a no through traffic sign on that street. It's completely gone. So somebody's like done away with the sign, and so we would just refresh all of those kinds of signs.
Okay. That might be all we have to show, unless there is a traffic calming action number 6. Oh, this is existing parking and occupancy for the Gardens neighborhood.
This is that snapshot that we were talking about. If you take a look at the sections that are in red, it's showing you where, you know, supply and demand are really not working too well together, and where some of the streets are very, very parked, and where there's really not a lot of existing supply available. So we would be looking at the possibility of a parking permit program there. When we surveyed East Palo Alto residents, they told us 3 things were important to them, they told us that they were interested in the possibility of a parking permit program. They told us that they were interested in the possibility of congestion pricing on University Avenue, where you would actually ask people to pay a toll to use University Avenue.
Oh, so it would be a toll road.
I mean, it has to be legislated, but it's possible.
So well, it seems to me if you make University a toll road, then that might increase the cut-through traffic.
Well,
that people will do everything they can to avoid tolls.
You know, again, you know, parking enforcement is a piece, enforcement is a piece of the puzzle, but we would have to make sure that all these pieces fit together. And again, you know, there would be a lot of planning involved in doing congestion pricing. I mean, it's not something that a city can just do. Like you have the recent example of Lombard Street in San Francisco, where people have determined, you know, that they would like to have a toll road there. And I understand the legislation has gone through, and that may or may not happen.
If you're going to use this street, you're going to pay for it.
Yeah, and for them, it's more of a scheduling thing, so they don't have the backup that they've had, I think. But yeah, you know, if the city council decided that that was something that they wanted to pursue, we have a long road to make something like that happen.
I would think so, because I'm thinking for local residents, and you live on University and you want to go 2 blocks up, So this would have to be for people at both ends of University. I'm thinking, how would you determine who's a local resident just driving along
Do you know, we
University?
haven't worked out any of the details of this. However, think about your fast track transponder. That can be programmed. That can be programmed to identify a local resident. I mean, we're going to have a toll road, or not a toll road, but an expedited road on Highway 101. And to create equity in that situation, those transponders or whatever like that are going to have to be calibrated in some way to, you know, make things move as they'd like to have them move, and to exempt certain kinds of people, maybe emergency vehicles or something like that, you know. So there are so many details to work out.
Let's talk about local control. The city of East Palo Alto has the power to implement, to establish toll roads, or this would have to be something that the state or the county would have to
It
get
has to be
involved
legislated. It has to
on
be
a
legislated.
state level.
Yes, yes, and just like on Lombard Street. Lombard Street residents couldn't just determine that they wanted to do that. They had to have it legislated.
And the a fee, a parking permit, would that be city? Would
That's
that be
city.
county?
That's city. That's city.
Okay.
Yeah, that's city. And again, what we're talking about, we're talking a little bit in the abstract here, because we're talking about some recommendations and some feelings that local residents have. And none of this has been cast in concrete. All of it will be vetted. And then the city council will make the ultimate decision about which things they want to pursue. But what we're really doing is trying to get creative about what the options might be.
Okay, let's look at another slide talking about options.
Okay.
To see what options we have. Now, this is existing parking occupancy, Weeks and Palo Alto Park.
That was the second neighborhood that we were going to look at, besides the gardens. And basically all this is doing is creating that baseline snapshot for you, showing you what the existing situation is, just like that former slide did.
Okay. Existing parking conditions on, let's see, what street is this?
I'm not sure.
Okay, we can't read that all that well, and I don't quite remember. And do we have another?
I mean, but what you can see is that you have, you know, rolled curbs, that you see that
Yes.
it's very difficult, you know,
Yes.
for probably strollers and others to be able to get down the street. And, you know, one of the suggestions, and I don't know if that's what the specific one is, but there is the possibility of, during certain hours of the day, only making one side of the street available for cars, and the other side of the, or cars to be parked, and the other side of the street for strollers and you know, disabled folks.
That would be
and others
interesting
walking.
because
Yeah.
after all, that sidewalk isn't all that wide. And with the vehicle parked halfway up.
Yep.
And that isn't even a good lane on the right-hand side for anybody to be going through.
Yeah, those are those older streets in the gardens, where, you know, you have the roll curbs like you do in many county areas. I grew up in an area like that, and it can be challenging.
And in some cases, that's an improvement because there was a time when there weren't sidewalks. So just the
true,
fact
yeah.
that the sidewalk is there is an improvement.
But, you know, we hear from people a lot of times. As I watched a young mother, you know, walk down the street with a stroller, and she had to get out in the street to be able to, you know, take her child down the street. And you don't want to hear that.
Yes, which would be the case in that slide. And I think we have another one.
And then again, it's just another example, I think, of the existing parking conditions in the Gardens neighborhood. There are some abandoned vehicles. There are some vehicles parked way up on the curb. I mean, you can see that nobody, could you imagine being in a wheelchair trying to traverse that sidewalk?
It would be enormously difficult. You couldn't, you'd have to be out in the street again. And we have another slide, the next one.
And I think this is an important one. For every suggestion, there's a reason why to do it, and there's a reason why not to do it. There's somebody with a vested interest in pedestrian safety, and there's another person who's wanting to get across town quickly. In terms of parking, do you need 5 permits per household, or can you get by with 2? Emergency vehicles, we're obviously working with Menlo Fire to make sure that, that nothing we propose is going to create any kind of a hazard, to the public safety.
It seems to me when you talk about parking permits that you would have a parking permit for each car owner. Now, people have to pay for those permits, do they?
All being worked out. We have laid out some of the possibilities, but again, this is something that needs to belong to the community. And so, city staff and others are not there 24 hours a day. People who live there are. And they need to, help guide us in the city council in terms of making reasonable solutions.
Now, I saw something about a $200 for a permit or $100 for another type of permit. But
people asked us to sort of lay out what it might look like. And so the consultant Hexagon laid out what it might look like. But I was just looking at the survey. We had 32 responses so far from the Gardens neighborhood, that 1,200 mailer that I was mentioning. And it's very, very interesting to me that a number of people are saying, yeah, that's right on point. That makes a lot of sense. Some people saying it's way too expensive. Some people saying it's not enough money.
Well, I would almost think, I would have a problem living in a city where I would have to pay $200 for a parking permit just to park in my own driveway or in front of my own house.
Or you could get the first two free and then have to pay after that. I'm just saying that we haven't figured it out.
However, I remember living in New York City in an apartment building and I had to pay to use the underground garage. Yeah, you had to pay, each person had to have a space, you had to pay a certain amount per month.
All to be figured out. But when the consultant was asked to sort of lay out what a parking program might look like, because how are you going to react to something unless you know sort of what the possibilities are? People haven't thought about these concepts before. But when I was working in Palo Alto, one of the issues that came up was you had many daytime workers that were taking all the parking in some of the neighborhoods, and so the city had to craft a parking program that made sense for the residents.
What did the city do?
I don't remember the details because it's really not my sort of area of expertise, and I left about that time. But as I recall, it had a positive impact.
Well, it seems to me it's quite difficult for people commuting in. First of all, they have to have that long commute, and then once they get there, can you imagine not being people complaining that you're parking on a city street? What are you supposed to do?
Well, there are other options. The train station is right there. I took the train 12 years.
I thought you might say parking, using the parking garage. But then at the same time, there were more and more people, there would be more and more people taking the train if the public transportation system was adequate.
Absolutely, and it ran better hours. How are you going to be somebody working in a restaurant bar and get out at 2 a.m. and take the train? That's not reasonable.
Yes, so especially if the train stopped at, 11 p.m. or...
Sure. But during peak hours, like getting more people on the train and having employers, issue passes. And, one of the things that the city's been looking at is just participation in a transportation management program. And we know we could do that with a neighboring city, and we actually could do things like issue, passes for people that are working during the daytime.
You have mentioned that transportation management program several times. What would something like that involve?
Well, there are two transportation management programs. One is the transportation management demand program, which is actually a policy that the City Council would develop in order to have an impact on the number of people that are traveling and to be able to provide some resources to get people out of their cars. And then there's a transportation management agency, which would help to issue some of those resources to make that practically work.
Okay. I think we have another slide.
Okay.
We'll see if, there we go.
And again, these are we were asked to, the consultant was asked to sort of lay out what some of the possibilities were for a parking program in the Gardens neighborhood, and this is just kind of a graphic representation of that.
All right, and the next one. Restricted parking. Rejected parking. Thank you. You can read it better than I can. Well, let's talk about those and what the idea was, the strategy, and what the rejection.
Well, these were rejected based on the community meeting that we had. They could come back, but it's unlikely. But this one particularly removes overnight parking. It's very hard to read it.
Remove overnight parking restriction adjacent to University Square Park.
Oh, you know what this one is around the parks, and most cities have this, or many cities have this. The police department likes to be able to see into a park to make sure that there's no illicit activity going on. And one of the strategies we suggested was freeing up some of that parking. And we heard from residents, and we also heard from the police that they didn't think that was a very good idea.
Sure. And the next one is convert narrow streets to one-way flow to maintain parking on both sides and to free up the sidewalks. And that seems to make a lot of sense, to make streets one-way.
Yes.
Especially the narrow street that we just now saw.
The problem with that is the folks in the Gardens neighborhood really said to us, don't make our streets one-way streets. They're not saying that we couldn't restrict them for several hours a day on one side of the street so that the sidewalk was free, but they're saying they don't want one-way streets. And they were really vocal about that, and about the fact that they thought it would have a really negative impact to their community.
That's really quite interesting given how narrow the streets are.
Yeah.
That it's difficult to have parking, as we saw, on both sides. And even though it was two lanes going in opposite directions, it seemed only large enough with the parking on both sides to be one lane straight down the middle.
I mean, there could be support for no parking on the sidewalk on one side of the street during given hours. And then have there be no support for turning it into a complete one-way street. And that was what we were hearing from people.
Sure. And heaven forbid if it were completely a walking area, you know, in some cities where they have pedestrians only.
Well, you go to Boulder, and, you know, Boulder's got that whole downtown mall, you know, where it's all completely walkable. And, you know, this is not Boulder. But
not only that, you can't do, as in Palo Alto, for example, have bike lanes. I mean, you can hardly have 2 lanes for cars going in opposite directions.
Yes.
And enough room for pedestrians, so having a bicycle lane would be out of the question.
I mean, I think there are some places where that might work, and I think that would have to be studied, and folks would really have to, you know, take a look at how that could have a positive impact. But you know, I think that the pedestrian overcrossing bridge is one of those kind of things that's, you know, a great idea. And, you know, it's been in the city works for many, many years. And now you have the first pedestrian overcrossing bridge between Palo Alto and East Palo Alto. What a great thing that is.
Yes, it is. And I think we might have another slide coming up that might show another. We may have that one later. So this is a daytime parking restriction.
And that's what I was talking about when I said, you know, that say from 8 to 6, you could have one side of the sidewalk only available for pedestrians and others. And this is how it might work. So.
And thus far, there isn't any. This is an idea that may not have been presented to the community, or it has not been rejected yet.
It has not been rejected.
Yes. And do we have another slide? Purpose of resident permit parking program.
You know, you want equitable allocation of on-street parking. You want to make sure that, you know, one family doesn't take up the parking for the whole street, or that out-of-town residents are not taking up the parking. So you're really looking for equity. You're wanting to encourage residents to use available off-street parking. So to incentivize that, like, you know, having them be able to use their own driveways might be a good way to do that. You could encourage residents to sell or donate excess vehicles. That wasn't real popular, but people have the opportunity to do that. And revenue could be generated to fund parking enforcement. There's one slide in the presentation to the Public Works and Transportation Commission that really talked about, you know, if you did this much enforcement, it could cover this much of a person's salary or something like that. So you could actually generate the revenues to do the enforcement.
As long as, I'm thinking when you're talking about enforcement, and you're talking about enforcement in a community like East Palo Alto, one has to make sure you're not penalizing the residents who live there and making the money off of the lack of space
Yes.
or the lack of accommodations that already exist in the city. So how can you then set up parking plans and parking permits that actually serve people and not be something that would turn against them or be...
By being good listeners and having them tell us what works and what doesn't work. You know, we can throw out as many suggestions as we want to, but the people that live there every single day are the ones that should have the voice. And that's what we're trying to do.
Okay. Do we have another slide? Or have we come to the, we still have more to go.
Okay, we did talk briefly about the oversized vehicle overnight parking restriction, and this is already in place.
Okay. And the next slide, if there is one. And so this is a project that's to be, I guess, another overpass that might be along...
This is the one I think that was actually completed.
Opened
and I think
Clark.
that, yeah, it was provided to show something really
Okay.
positive that had happened.
Pedestrian bicycle overpass.
And there's talk of a second one now.
And I think that might be in our next slide, unless it was deleted and unless this is the last one. And since that one's there for the longest time, that must be the last one. So we've talked about the baseline. We've talked about some community meetings that were held. We've talked about other community meetings that will be held. Mm-hmm. And so let's continue with the process, what we can expect.
I think it's really our objective to lay out some possibilities that can be actionable. And I think that the responsibility of city staff and others is to make sure that, you know, we layer the opportunity to be able to give input in as positive a way as we can. Like one thing that was very surprising to me is we mailed to these 1,200 residents of the Gardens neighborhood, and I've gotten 8 requests from people that wanted an online survey mailed because they didn't have internet access.
No, I have one question when you talk about surveying city residents in one particular neighborhood and listening to the community. One would expect to have or want to have as much community feedback as possible. For example, if you have only 8% of the residents in that particular neighborhood responding, it wouldn't be fair to all the other residents to go on the basis of the feedback from those 8%. So how is one going to make sure that the community feedback is representative of a specific neighborhood?
2 things are happening. There's one community-wide survey that will go to everybody in the community, and it's available online in both English and Spanish, and we'll mail out a survey to anybody who asks us. We've also gone to Cinco de Mayo and Juneteenth and other community events to make sure that anybody who wants to fill out a survey can do that. But for a resident parking program for the Gardens, we would only want Gardens residents to participate in that survey to tell us, do you park in your driveway? How many cars do you have per household? All that stuff, right? So it wouldn't be helpful for us to have citywide data on that. It's really most helpful for us to have really specific Gardens data. And so there's 2 surveys.
Yes, it would. However, you have the rest of the city residents using the Garden neighborhoods also. In
from other
visiting and
cities.
driving through. Yeah. No, just from East Palo Alto. What I'm saying is you would have East Palo Alto residents in other neighborhoods also driving through all of the neighborhoods within their city. So should they have anything to say necessarily about what's happening in any particular neighborhood? You mentioned the citywide survey.
Right.
And then you mentioned just, let's say, the Gardens.
Okay, see, I think we're saying the same thing in a different way. The Gardens survey is specifically related to parking. And parking only. It's not related to cut through traffic. It's not related to any of those other factors.
But I would be affected if I were an East Palo Alto resident from another neighborhood who wanted to go visit a friend of mine or a relative who lived in the Gardens.
Sure. And I mean, we're not excluding anyone from doing that, but we really have our focus on the Gardens neighborhood.
In the time that we have remaining, you talked about meetings on the September 14th.
August 14th.
August 14th. I thought there was one also coming up in September.
We're going to be going back to City Council in September with the Transportation Demand Management Policy and with an update on the mobility study. And I think those are the only 2 items that are going to be heard And that date isn't
And so
for
we're
sure.
talking about, you said this mobility study, this whole process will last between 12 months and 18 months.
That's how long the contract is, yeah.
Okay, so at the 18th month, what can one expect to have happen?
What we really hope is that we will have had the opportunity to really hear what residents have told us about the recommendations that are being proposed, and that we have some real actionable items that make residents and the city council and others feel that we've really moved the ball forward a little bit.
Now, actionable items also might demand money.
Yes.
So where will the money come from?
And again, you know, that has to be determined based on you know, what the strategy is and what it's going to cost to implement that. But we basically group things into short-term, mid-term, and long-range strategies. And for those short-term strategies, we would be looking, you know, for funds in the current capital improvement project, or to have funds allocated to do specific kinds of things. But that all needs to be worked out.
And there is a definite commitment to take action on the plan itself, because you know lots of plans are drafted and they go into a file cabinet, or
Yeah,
4 years have passed and nothing's been done. So what guarantees are there, if there are any guarantees at all, that this is a plan, some parts of it that will be implemented?
Well, that's why we've kind of wanted to go this recommendation way, because we really wanted something for the City Council and for the Public Works and Transportation Commission and the community to react to, and to say, move this forward, don't move this forward, move this forward, don't move this forward. And then we're going to be able to put together an implementation plan that makes that happen.
And the very upshot of the plan, if it's implemented, would mean what for the city?
That we would have a positive impact on the traffic flow, that we would have a positive impact on safety, that we'd have a positive impact on the emissions that are coming through the city, you know, and having a negative impact on children's health, that, you know, we really were able to deliver in ways that were meaningful to the community to have a better quality of life.
And we will see that the final stage of the plan you mentioned at the end of the 18 months, and that would be when?
Well, I mean, it could be that, you know, we're able to move forward with many of these things in September, but the more midterm and long-term things, and even some of the short-term things, might take longer to implement, depending on whether or not the City Council sees those as a priority. Again, you know, the City Council has got the ultimate authority in terms of determining, you know, how this will all be implemented and be played out in the future.
Well, we have seen that this is something the City Council has started. It's one of the City Council's priorities. And you've just now said that the city has the ultimate responsibility, and it will be held accountable by city residents for enacting and implementing some type of plan that will come out of this project, this transportation and mobility study. Susan, thank you so much for sharing. It's been a pleasure to have you, and I'm delighted that we could share this information with our viewers, and I'd like to thank our viewers for watching. Until next time.